welcome to today's webinar on TracerPlus Conditional Logic and learning how to make your mobile inspection forms enterprise class. I am your presenter, Joe Kraebel, and I am a mobile solutions architect here at Portable Technology Solutions. All right, so now I'm going to jump into the live demonstration. So the first thing I'm going to show you today is a pre-built item inspection form that I created. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit and show you that, what's possible with Logic, and dig a little bit into the some of the settings of how I did some of the things. And then we'll go ahead and create something from scratch. So first I will show my device here. So the idea here is an item inspection where the user will actually scan a barcode, and based on the type of item, it will display relevant fields based on that item within that same form. So previously, where you may have had to do this, in 3 different sessions, or maybe a single session with 3 or 4 different tabs, we can now do in a single session on a single form page. So I already have a list of preloaded items here. So you'll see here we have a boiler, a water pump, and an extinguisher, and these are their item numbers. So the idea here is we jump into our item inspection, and based on what we actually scan, it should present us with different options. So if I scan 1001, you'll see that we're prompted for a boiler inspection, since we're actually scanning a boiler. So based on that, we have fields here of heating element, valve leak, and a condition. So we can actually select some of these valves here, or values I should say. And then if I were to try and save the inspection, we're going to get a validation that we should select a condition. And you'll notice because of that, we actually turn this condition label red, notifying the user that that's what they missed and that's what they should be filling out. So we'll go ahead and select good, and then we can save that inspection. And then we'll return to the main screen here where we scan an item to begin inspection. So now if I scan a different item, being a water pump, so item 1002, you'll see that we're now prompted for a water pump inspection. So we have a check valve option, a water pressure, tank visual, and we still have condition. So condition will be available for all of these, but you'll see that the top 2 or 3 fields are going to interchange based on the item type. So I'll go ahead and enter some values here, and we'll say this one is fair. And we'll save that. Next one, we'll scan a fire extinguisher. So you'll see that prompts us for the extinguisher inspection, where we can enter our pressure, whether it's expired or not, and our condition. So now there's another piece of the puzzle here. So if we select a condition of poor, we're now going to display another field to the user of needs repair. So if the condition is poor, more than likely it's probably going to need repair. So we can actually enable that checkbox. And then once we save that inspection, we're also going to send an email stating that this item needs repaired. So you'll see, we'll save that. And if I were to actually exit this application and look in my outbox, we'll see a new email was generated based on that item we just scanned. So you'll see here we sent a new email to myself, the subject being new repair, and we have a simple report here stating the below inspection item needs repair. We have our item ID, the type, the condition, and when it was inspected. So we're using Logic to display different items based on the item type. So we're showing and hiding fields. We're also displaying that needs repair field based on a condition's value. And we're actually sending an email based on an item being checked or not. So that we're all doing with Logic. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK to this and relaunch TracerPlus. And I just want to go over some of the settings here that I did to actually make some of this happen. So you'll see here we have our form, item inspection, some controls here. Here's our condition, here's our needs repair. And then on the right-hand side here, we have some sets of fields that I'm showing and hiding based on that item that's inspected. So I'm going to open up our logic editor. You'll see it's this little, the rightmost icon with the lightning bolt. This is where you can add different rules and actions to perform your logic. So you'll see here when we first open the form, and if we compare that to our form designer, you'll see that we're not showing the condition or the needs repair or even the save inspection button, because they shouldn't have access to any of that until they actually scan an item. So what I'm doing in that case is doing a form initialize. So that's saying whenever we open the form or even after a submit is performed, that's when a form initialize event happens. So I'm basically saying on form initialize, we're setting visible here. So we're setting an action. So we're setting visible to a control ID. So another thing we can do is show our ID hints. So if I click this ID button, it shows all of our control IDs. So that makes it a lot easier when you're configuring your logic to see what you're configuring for. So we have a control ID of 33. So if we look to see what control ID 33 is, we'll see that that's our scan an item to begin inspection. So on form open, we're setting that to visible. So the reason we're doing that is because on a submit, or actually on an item scan, we're actually removing that or hiding that from view. So in order to show that again, we need to set that visible on a form initialize and set that to true. And we're doing the opposite for most of the other controls. So our 6, 7, 8, and 9, these fields here that we're not showing on form open, that's the same form initialize rule here where we're setting visible of those control IDs and we're setting that to false. And then we have to do the same for all our fields or different form options here on the right-hand side where we're showing and hiding our inspection item fields. So on a form initialize, we want to put those off the form. So that's what this form initialize set position is. We're basically saying set the position to left 300. So I'm currently using a Windows embedded device where the form width is 240. So setting it to 300 will put that off the form so the user doesn't see it. So now if we get into some of the other stuff when we actually scan an item, so you'll see that our item ID is control ID 41. So I'm doing an after scan event. So that means a barcode scan, or if you were to key data in followed by an enter key press, that's what's known as an after scan event. So whenever we have that event in this field, we're going to trigger some things to happen. So we can also set if conditions. So basically what we're saying here on after scan of the item ID field, if control is not equal to null. So you'll see here we have some comparison types available, whether it's equals, not equals, and then your standard greater than, less than, starts with, ends with, and contains. So what I'm saying here is if item, actually item type, so if we look at control ID 5, that's over here hidden off the form, but we're actually, once we scan an item ID, we're looking up that item type. So that's what's driving most of what's displaying on the form. So once we scan the item ID, if that item type is not blank, we're setting visible to 27 true. So basically we're saying if we scan a valid item, we're displaying our save inspection button and setting that as visible true. So now we're able to save that inspection once it's been scanned. We're doing some similar things here. This is probably for our condition fields. Yeah, that's for our condition, label, and field. And then we're hiding our control 33. So that's that scan an item to begin inspection. So as soon as we scan a valid item, we're hiding that control. Next up, so this is how we're displaying our needs repair option. So we're saying on an after scan of 7, so that's our condition field. Once we select a valid condition from that drop-down, it's going to trigger this event here if that condition is equal to poor. So if our condition here, control 7, is equal to poor, we're setting visible our needs repair label and our needs repair checkbox to true. And here is where we're turning that condition label red. So we're basically saying if control 7 is equal to blank, so basically that means if nobody fills out, if you don't select a condition and it's left blank, we're going to set that back color of the condition label to this color here of red. And you'll see that if I click this, you can pick any color you want. You can even define custom colors and enter your own RGB values. And then also when we do an if statement or an if condition, we can actually perform an else. So we have this checkbox for perform else. So if the condition is not null, then we're just setting it to our background form color, which is this, I believe it's a dark slate gray. So that's the basics of the form itself. Now, once we get into the item types, we're doing a bunch of things here. So you'll see we have 8 or 9 rules here for each type of item. So we have our water pump rules, our boiler rules, and our extinguisher rules. So we're basically saying once we scan an item ID, and if its control or item type is water pump, now we're setting visible to certain controls. So the first thing we're doing is setting visible to control 31. So that's basically telling you what type of item you're scanning and the type of inspection. So if I were to jump back over to my form, I scan an item, you'll see that this little blue line appears with boiler inspection. So that we're setting that control to visible true, and then we're also going to set its value. So here, if control 5 equals water pump, we're setting a value to that control of water pump inspection. And then the last things we're going to do for this is set the positions of these 3 sets of fields here for water pump inspection. So once we scan that, what we want to do is take their current position and move them to a position that's visible on the form. So that's where the set position comes in. So we're basically saying control 12 and 13. So you see here we can actually expand the view of set coordinates. So we're basically setting the coordinates of the control on the form. So we're saying that this label should display at a left of 10, top of 87, and have a width of 90 with a height of 16. And then we're going to do the same for the fields. So this is, most likely going to be further to the right of that label control. So that's why the left is 105 versus 10. But we're going to have a similar top value. We have a width of 120 and a height of 90 because it's a drop-down, because we want to display those drop-down items. And we repeat that for the remaining fields. You'll see that a lot of the position values will stay the same. The only thing will change are the heights. So you'll see here we have a 112 and a 110, and then a 137 and 135. So that's basically spacing out the fields 25 pixels lower than each other. And then the last thing we did for the water pump was basically specify a go-to control. So if I scan an item here, let's say 1002, a water pump, you'll see that that cursor is automatically focused to check valve. So what we did here was set a go-to control action. So we're basically telling it to go to a control ID of 13, which happens to be that check valve field. So then we basically do the same for our boiler and our extinguisher. And the last thing we do is configure our email rule. So we're creating an on-submit rule or event. So basically when we save that inspection, if control 9 being that needs repair. So if that control 9 checkbox is equal to true or checked, we're clicking button 39. So now if we look at button 39, we'll see that that's a send email button. So you'll see that that button is configured to send a message. So once we submit, that's clicking that 39 button if that needs repair box is checked, and it's triggering our send message option using our item inspection report. So now what we want to do is maybe try and create something from scratch here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. And maybe we'll name, maybe we can do a fire extinguisher inspection. So we'll make it more specific other than the, the 3 items that we were inspected in our general item inspection. So we'll call this extinguisher inspections. And if we jump over to session 1, we'll call this extinguisher inspection. So the first thing we may have, we'll define our fields here, so we'll call this an extinguisher ID. Maybe we'll have an extinguisher type, or we'll just call it type. And maybe we'll have current pressure. We could do last reading. So what was our last pressure? We'll have our expired option. Or maybe you can have a needs service, and then maybe a comments field. So the idea here is to scan an extinguisher ID and look up that last reading. So in order to do that, we'll need an item list. So I'll add another session here. We'll call it our extinguisher list. And it'll have similar fields. We'll have our extinguisher ID, our type, and our last reading. And what we'll do is we'll look those values up from our extinguisher inspection app. So if we come to our type, we'll go to our lookup options, and we'll set this to extinguisher list. So we're going to look this value up from our extinguisher list based on our extinguisher ID, and we're going to look up that type field. So the last reading, we're going to do the same thing, extinguisher list based on extinguisher ID, and we're looking up our last reading. So now what we also want to do is update our extinguisher list with our current pressure, so that the next time they scan, they will see that our current pressure is the last reading. So I'm going to add a hidden field down here called update pressure. And I'm going to set that to a calculated field. So we're going to do that same lookup. We're going to enable lookups, look in our extinguisher list based on an extinguisher ID. And we're going to look up our last reading. The one thing that's going to differ here is I'm going to enable the update source option so that when we submit this record, it's going to update this lookup with whatever this field's value is. So in order to get the current pressure into this field, that's where the calculated option comes into play. So we're basically just going to do an add function. So we're going to concatenate that current pressure into this update pressure field, so that when we submit the record, that current pressure is going to update our extinguisher list. That's really all we're going to update here, so I can remove fields 9 and 10. And now we can define some of our fields here a little bit further. So type, since we're looking that up, we can set this as read-only. Current pressure, most likely this is going to be a number. We could set this to a number field and use the number pop-up. This is helpful if you don't have number keys on your device or if you have to shift to get number keys. This makes it a little bit easier to enter that data. Our last reading, this was a lookup, so we can also mark that as read-only. Expire, that can be a checkbox. Same as needs service. And comments will be a text box. Update pressure, like I said, that's going to be hidden from view, so we can mark that as visible false. So now let's define the flow of our app. So once we do an after scan, or once we scan the extinguisher ID, we already have the type. So we don't need to go to the type field. We'll just go to our current pressure. And then current pressure doesn't need to go to last reading, so we'll have that go to expired. Expired will go to need service, and need service to comments. Comments can just go to itself, because then we'll press a submit button. All right, so now if we go to our form designer, we'll go ahead and build a default form here. So you'll see we have a basic form here, so we can pretty it up a little bit. I won't go into it too much. I'll just adjust some things a little bit here. Maybe we'll line these fields up a little better. And I'll make these all the same width. And I can slide those over with my arrow key. And then our comments field, maybe we want that to be multi-line. So we can jump over to our form properties and set multi-line to true. Now we have a multi-line comment field. I'll just adjust some of my labels here because they're a little high. Set that to a height of 16. Slide those over a little bit and down. And we'll just drop these down a little bit. And we'll move these up. And now I'll go ahead and deploy this to our device. So now this form should look just like what we had just designed here. So if we go into the form, here's our extinguisher inspection form. You'll see some refresh buttons here. That's for lookups. We can actually hide those. And then our check boxes, we can even size those correctly to the form. So you'll see it's actually showing a little bit of the label here. So I'll just go to our type field, set that to hide refresh button true. Do the same for our last reading. And our check boxes will make a size of 18 by 18. And we'll make them the same back color as our form, which I believe is control. So I'll go ahead and deploy those changes real quick. Now if we look at our extinguisher inspection, you'll see that we got rid of those refresh buttons, and also our check boxes no longer have the spacing after them. So the next thing we want to do is get some data on here. So I'll delete my previous data. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and enter a few inspections right here, extinguishers right here on the device, but you could load these from our TracerPlus Connect software, so you can get those extinguisher lists from, an Access database, SQL, MySQL, text file, Excel sheet, wherever that data may reside. So say that's our extinguisher 1001. It's a small extinguisher, and we don't have a last reading yet. Say this is a medium-sized extinguisher, and we'll do one more. We will call this one large. All right, so now if I were to scan an extinguisher, it should be able to look up that type, and then it'll jump to our current pressure. So we'll say pressure of 25, and we'll submit. Say this one's at 20. Maybe that's a little low. We'll say needs service. And 1003, we'll do 35. And submit. So now if I were to scan one of those again, you'll see that we now have a last reading. So our last reading is 25. So far we built the form, we're able to do some lookups. But now we probably want to make some things happen based on some of this data. So maybe we want to compare the current pressure to the last reading, and if it exceeds a certain amount, maybe we want to trigger a warning or send an email, or even highlight a field. So now I'm going to create some logic rules to do just that. So let's click, first I'm going to click my ID so I can see our control IDs. I'm going to click our logic editor. So let's say we want to track if the pressure changes more than, 3 psi. So the first thing we'll want to do actually is add a field in our form to calculate that pressure. So field 9, we'll call this pressure difference or pressure diff, and we'll set this as a calculated field and a number. So we're basically going to take our current pressure and subtract it from our last reading. So I'm just going to change this function to subtract. So that's going to get a value based on our current and last reading. So let's say anything that exceeds 3, we want to fire maybe a warning message. So let's jump back over to our logic editor, and we'll add a new rule here. So you'll see we have a variety of different events you can choose from. On focus, lost focus, after scan, a field value change, a form initialize, and on click. Whether validation is failed or is successful, whether a calc's refreshed, a lookup's refreshed, and on submit, you can even trigger rules on sync complete or live mode connect or disconnect, as well as some cache grid inserts and updates. I do want to mention I am using a 9.1 version, so some of these rules may be new, but we wanted to kind of give you a sneak peek of 9.1 at the same time here. So in this case, we're going to do an after scan of our current pressure. So we'll do an after scan event, and our current pressure is control 9. So we have 9 here. So then we can do an if condition. So we can say, so one thing we're going to need to do here is add that field that we just added to our form. So I'm going to click our field control and put it off the form here. I'm just going to slide this out of the way for a sec. And this will be our pressure difference field. So you'll see that that added is a control ID of 21. So we're going to say if 21, so we'll say if that is greater than or equal to 3, and we're going to show a message. So you'll see here we can also select a variety of different actions based on these events. So we can do a click, so we can actually click a button. We can execute a SQL statement. We actually did a full webinar on custom SQL, so you may want to check that out to see what you can do with SQL within TracerPlus itself. We have a go-to control, a go-to page. We can play sounds. We can refresh controls. We can set back colors, set fonts, set font colors, set position, as you saw in the previous application. We can set things as read-only, as true or false. We can set things as visible. We can actually enable or disable validation based on certain things. Set values, set visible. We can show message, what we're going to do here. We can even trigger an after scan or validate a field. So we're going to show message. And we can say we don't need a control ID for this, but our value can be, let's say, pressure change warning. I will say pressure changed 3 or more PSI. And we don't want to perform an else in this case. I'll just duplicate this rule. And we'll change this to -3. And we can say less than or equal to. Actually, let's just click out of that and deploy. All right, so let's scan. That was 24. Let's do a 21. So there, because we're at 3, oops, I just clicked that and hit our message here. So let me do that again. So there's our message we're showing to the user, pressure change warning, pressure change 3 or more PSI. So that alerts the user that, hey, something may be up here. I should probably look into this further. So if we were to change this to 20, we should still get that rule or that message because it's greater than 3. And if we change that to 22, we're not going to get that message because it's not less than 3. Or if we wanted to exceed that, we could go 27, and that should engage our other rule of it being greater. So there, that's just prompting the user that, hey, your current pressure is greater than it should be at this point. You know, hey, take a look at that. So maybe we want to expand on this further, and maybe we want to highlight that current pressure field red when this also occurs. So if we jump back over to our form designer, it's basically going to be a similar rule. So you can either add a new rule or you can duplicate a rule depending on, you know, if the if conditions are the same. So I can actually highlight both of these and hit duplicate, and it'll duplicate both of these so that I have my same conditions here. So for these, instead of show message, I want to do a set back color. And then in this case, I want to set our back color of our current pressure, which is control ID 9. So I'll set this to 9. And now we'll see our action value is now a color picker. So we'll set this to red. And we'll also do the same for our instance of it being in the negative. Set back color, set it to red. And we won't perform an else in this case, but let's also set our control ID of 9. And let's go ahead and deploy that. Now if I scan our extinguisher again, enter something greater than 3 or 3. So we get our message here, and it also turned our current pressure field red. So you'll see this is a good way to prompt or warn users without having to use validation, which is kind of an end-all be-all where it wouldn't even let them to submit the record. So in this case, you can actually now display warnings and prompts, but still allowing them to accept that and still submit the record. So now maybe we want to enable sending an email when needs service is checked. So now what we can do is add a button to our form here. So I'll click the button control, place that on our form, and we'll call that just email. And we'll set our button action to send message. We'll choose our report, which is also something new in 9.1. The ability to actually send different email reports from the same session. So you can actually associate a single report to an actual button. The same goes for printing. So the first thing I'll need to do is jump over to our messaging, enable our messaging, and then select the report we want to use here. So we'll do item inspection. We can choose what we want to send, whether it's current record, all records, or print what. We can send that message automatically. And then the type of messaging, whether it's email or an SMS text, sender account. I'm using a Windows embedded device, so the email account is ActiveSync. We can set who we want it to go to. Now this can either be a static email entered here, or you can actually add a variable to your email report to grab an email address from the form. So if you have different email addresses entered to a field on a form, you can actually send those reports to different people. In this case, I'm just going to do my email. If you did want more information on email reports, we did just do a webinar on that as well. So you may want to check that out. In subject, we'll say extinguisher needs service. Now if we jump back over to our form designer, go to our email, we should now have our item inspection report to choose from. So now we have control ID 22 for that. So let me find my logic editor here. So I'm going to add a new rule. So in this case, we want to do this on submit. So once we submit, we're going to do a on submit. There's no event control in this case, but we want to say if. So if control 15, which is our needs service. So if control 15 is equal to true, we want to click that button. So we're going to set an action of click, and we're going to click ID 22. You'll see that the other fields are not applicable, so we put a little NA in there. So now on submit, if this need service is checked, it should go ahead and send an email out. Let me go ahead and deploy this. All right, so we'll say 1003, say it's at 33, and then we'll say need service, and then we can even comment if we wanted to. We can say maybe someone took it off the wall or the wall hanger fell off. We'll say needs to be mounted to wall again. And then we can submit that. You'll see that our little message prompt popped up briefly. So it sent an email. So if I exit TracerPlus, I should see something in my outbox here. So here's our email getting ready to be sent. So it's extinguisher needs service. Now keep in mind this report was designed for that other session I did. Some of these fields, probably won't make sense. Obviously item ID is not in the right spot, and some of our other fields are not there. But you configure your report to include whatever fields that you want. But just to kind of show you that, I just triggered an email here based on that needs service being checked. We'll go ahead and reopen TracerPlus 9. So now maybe we want to force our comments fields to be entered if we have needs service checked. So we basically want to prevent the user from submitting the record if need service is checked and they don't enter any comments. So the first thing we want to do is turn on validation for our comments field by going to our field settings, validation, and we'll set it to a min length of 1. We'll say you must enter a comment if needs service is checked. So now, if I were to deploy this now, this would require us to have this filled out all the time, which we don't want unless, need service is checked. So what we can do is enable, disable validation based on certain things. So if we jump back over to our form, so initially we don't want this field to be to have validation enabled. So if I click Add, we want to do a form initialize rule. And we want to say set validation enabled of control 17. We want to set that to false. So when we open the form, that control should not be enabled. So that should allow us to submit records without that having to be entered as long as need service is not checked. So now we want to enable that validation when need service is checked. So we'll add another rule here. We'll call this on submit. And we'll do an if condition, probably similar to our email rule. So if 15 is equal to true, then we want to set validation enabled of 17 to true, and then in this case we do want to do an else false. Now if I deploy this, go into our extinguisher inspection. Now if I were to just hit submit, I should be allowed to submit because that validation is not enabled yet. If I scan an extinguisher and I don't check that need service, I should still be able to submit. Now if I scan another one and I check this and hit submit, nope, that should have fired. I'm not sure why that didn't. I may want to actually do an on-click here. So let's do an on-click of our submit button of 19. And actually, I will move this up in order because it does respect order. So I usually like to keep my form initialize rules up top, followed by after scan, and then some of the other actions that happen after the fact. It may also be that my checkbox value of true is not being seen right away until the record is submitted. So let's just see if that works. If not, we may need to change this a little bit. There we go. So now on click of submit, so the submit's not actually taking place yet. So that's probably why it didn't trigger before. We're not physically, we're actually submitting before that could take place. We want to try to trigger this before the submit takes place, so we can do so by that on click of the submit button. So now it's prompting us to enter the comment if need service is checked. So now we'll say mount, and we should now be able to submit. So as you can see, you can really now customize the flow of this form with our new conditional logic. That's pretty much what I wanted to show you today. Hope it gives you an idea of what's possible with conditional logic. I want to thank you all for joining us today on our conditional logic webinar, and I hope you got everything that you needed out of it. So I hope, thanks for coming out, and enjoy the rest of your day.